What this episode explores, what you tolerate says more about you than what you seek, is part of a larger conversation that this series is building episode by episode. Not in a linear way, but in a spiral. Each layer examined reveals something that was beneath the previous one, and what was beneath the previous one only becomes visible after seeing what was above. There is a reason why these themes resist examination. It's not a lack of interest. Anyone who has made it this far clearly has an interest. It's that what this series explores is so integrated into how you function that examining it requires a specific type of attention. The attention that can observe without immediately defending, justifying, or dismissing what is being seen. This attention is not natural for most people. The system prefers to confirm what it already knows about itself rather than find something that contradicts that image. That's why the most important patterns are often the hardest to see, not because they are hidden, but because they are so present that they have come to seem simply like reality rather than a specific construction with history and origin. However, this attention can be trained. And the training starts right here, not with grand revelations that transform everything at once, but with the willingness to sit with the question long enough for it to find where it connects with what you already knew but hadn't yet articulated precisely. What you tolerate says more about you than what you seek. This episode about what you tolerate says more about you than what you seek. It's worth naming what happens when you recognize a pattern described in this episode. The first reaction is often to apply it to other people, to identify someone you know who clearly lives this pattern, or to think that someone needs to hear this. This is easier than applying it to yourself, and it's a completely human response. The system prefers to process difficult information from a distance before bringing it closer to its own territory. But the real value of this conversation is proportional to the honesty with which you can ask the question that really matters. To what extent is this operating in me? Not to condemn, not to immediately resolve. To see clearly enough that the distance between you and the pattern is created, the distance that transforms "this is how I am" into "this is how I learn to be." And that distance, no matter how small, is where choice exists. It's the gap between the trigger and the automatic response. It's the space where something different can happen, not because you forced it, but because you finally managed to see what was happening before reacting. There is something specific about what you tolerate says more about you than what you seek that distinguishes it from simply hearing about an interesting concept. You have likely felt what it describes before you had the words to name it. You may have called it something else: fatigue, temperament, bad luck, how things are specifically for you. But the pattern was present. And when a pattern that was nameless finally receives a name, something changes. Not the pattern itself, at least not immediately, but the relationship with it. You move from being within the pattern without knowing you are in a pattern to being in a pattern that can be observed from the outside, even if just for a moment, even if with difficulty, even if the pattern remains strong. That moment, the moment when the pattern becomes visible, is the starting point for anything that comes after. The awareness that creates possibility is not dramatic. It's often silent. It's the moment when you notice what was always happening and now has enough name to be examined. There is a principle that runs throughout this series and is worth making explicit. The change of lasting behaviors begins with awareness, not willpower. Trying to stop a pattern without understanding it is like trying to stop a current without knowing where the water comes from. The force will last as long as it lasts. Awareness creates something more structural because it changes what you see, not just what you decide. Research in behavioral psychology is consistent on this point. The honest recognition that a pattern exists, how it works, and where it came from, This recognition is what creates the real possibility for something different to happen. It doesn't guarantee it. It's not enough by itself to produce change, but it is a necessary condition. What has been learned can be examined. What can be examined can be questioned. What can be questioned can, with time and honest work, be chosen differently, consciously maintained because it still serves, or gradually set aside because it has already served its purpose and no longer fits the current context of your life. To take from this conversation not a list of things to correct immediately, but a question that continues to work after the episode has ended. Does what has been presented here resonate with something you already felt but couldn't name precisely enough to work with? This question does not require an immediate or complete answer. The best questions in this series are the ones that come later, that arise in everyday situations where you recognize the pattern in action, where you can see for a moment what was always there and now has a name. That recognition, even if brief, is already information. It is already the beginning of something. Naming is the first act of any lasting change. Not because naming immediately resolves what has been built over years, it doesn't resolve it. But because what is unnamed operates in the dark, out of reach of any conscious choice. What has a name can be seen. What can be seen can be examined. What can be examined can, eventually, be chosen, instead of simply inherited and repeated without having had the opportunity to decide. Invisible Stoicism continues in the next episode. Each episode of this series has been constructed so that what was invisible gradually becomes more visible. Not all at once, in layers. And each layer, including this one, adds something to what came before, making the map more complete and navigation more possible. This conversation about the theme continues in the next episode with more depth and clarity. This conversation about the theme continues in the next episode with more depth and clarity. This conversation about the theme continues in the next episode with more depth and clarity. This conversation about the theme continues in the next episode with more depth and clarity. This conversation about the theme continues in the next episode with more depth and clarity. This conversation about the theme continues in the next episode with more depth and clarity. This conversation about the theme continues in the next episode with more depth and clarity. This conversation about the theme continues in the next episode with more depth and clarity. This conversation about the theme continues in the next episode with more depth and clarity. This conversation about the theme continues in the next episode with more depth and clarity. This conversation about the theme continues in the next episode with more depth and clarity. This conversation about the theme continues in the next episode with more depth and clarity. This conversation about the theme continues in the next episode with more depth and clarity. This conversation about the theme continues in the next episode with more depth and clarity. This conversation about the theme continues in the next episode with more depth and clarity. This conversation about the theme continues in the next episode with more depth and clarity. This conversation about the theme continues in the next episode with more depth and clarity. This conversation about the theme continues in the next episode with more depth and clarity. This conversation about the theme continues in the next episode with more depth and clarity. This conversation about the theme continues in the next episode with more depth and clarity. This conversation about the theme continues in the next episode with more depth and clarity. This conversation about the theme continues in the next episode with more depth and clarity. This conversation about the theme continues in the next episode with more depth and clarity. This conversation about the theme continues in the next episode with more depth and clarity. This conversation about the theme continues in the next episode with more depth and clarity. This series, Invisible Stoicism, has been built to create clarity where there was only confusion, to name what was always present but had never received enough attention to be examined honestly. The work continues in the next episode, with more depth, more context, more clarity about what is operating and what can be done from that.